Welcome to part 6 of understanding the Chameleon Slav, also known as the Chebanenko Slav. And I do recommend watching these videos in order of the playlist. It'll make more sense that way. So I'll put a link to it right above my head here or at the end of the show and also in the show notes. But let's get into the video for today. And we've been working our way through alternative opening setups in the Chebanenko when it's not necessarily our best choice to play our main Chebanenko Slav setup, which we see here. This is what we will play the majority of the time, but sometimes we can get even better positions, and we've already gone through 2 of these in depth, and we're going to actually look at this position here today. And this position, this alternative setup, is where we play an early c5 and possibly knight to c6, and we counter in the center aggressively. And so let's see how that would come about in an actual game and the reason we would do that. So we have something like a memory marker or a way to try to understand when we play these alternative setups. So this would come about going down our typical moves here. And once again, this alternative setup comes out of positions where white plays a4. And you've probably noticed we do a lot of these alternative setups when they play a4. Sometimes this b4 square is really weak, and it allows us some more aggressive setups to use against this way that white may play. And in previous videos, we discussed that we play e6, which effectively prevents a5. And I'm not going to explain why right now, but we did talk about that in a couple of the previous videos. And so now there's a couple moves that we'll look at, but we'll kind of focus mostly on e3 here. And now you notice when white plays e3, they do lock in this dark squared bishop. But more importantly, by locking in that dark squared bishop, normally, it would be more common for white to develop bishop to g5, which pins this knight to the queen and effectively destabilizes d5 a little bit. Like it fights against black's control over the d5 square. So if we go back and look at the position now, white hasn't actively challenged us and fought for our control of this d5 square. And so because he hasn't actively challenged us, and he hasn't destabilized this d5 pawn or square, we can fight more aggressively and do an immediate c5. And so this is the position that we'll kind of examine in some depth. We'll look at a few grandmaster games that arise from this type of position right here. But one thing to also mention real quickly, so we don't have to circle back to it later, is that instead of playing e3, if white plays bishop to f4, this also does not keep the knight from providing protection to d5. And so we can just play c5 in this instance as well, and we'll get similar type of positions. But just for the purpose of this video, we'll focus on moves where white plays e3 with the same general idea, is we can play c5 and aggressively go at the center. And so one thing that will happen is that white will eventually play c takes d5, and they may not do it like right away. They may make some normal development moves, in which case we will just make normal developing moves until they do that. And if they don't do that, we're going to get a good position. We'll equalize. But so let's just look at this position when they do take on d5. And basically, they're trying to give us an isolated pawn. So we actually are happy with that. And that'll be kind of like the main point of this video, is to understand why this is a good version of the isolated pawn and why we're willing to take on that isolated pawn, even though it's not something that we typically play in our, we more used to these restraint structures than taking on an isolated pawn. So let's just kind of fast forward a little bit into how play would probably go. So usually what will happen is if white is a strong player, they'll wait until we move our dark squared bishop, and then they'll take on c5 and give us the isolated pawn, because then we just moved our bishop twice in a row to recapture on c5. So they've effectively kind of won a tempo. But that's no worries to us, because this is a really good isolated pawn position. And the reason for that is because of white's move of a4. So because he has played e4, we can easily control this square in front of our isolated pawn. And that's kind of an important thing in these isolated pawn positions. And another thing you notice with this Chebanenko is, once again, this a6 move has some utility because it prevents the bishop from coming to b5, which would hamper the knight's control over the square in front of our isolated pawn. So for those two reasons, this is a good isolated queen pawn position for us. And I remember hearing something like, I think it was Terry said something like, he was afraid to play with an isolated pawn should give up chess. I think that's a little harsh, but maybe if somebody's afraid to play this isolated pawn position, that could be true, because this is a really good one. So like I said, the main point is that we have this bishop controls this square in front of our pawn, and it can't easily be repelled, right? It can always go back to this hiding hole. They don't have ideas like this, anything. So it's a good isolated pawn position. So I guess enough blabbing. Let's look at a few Grandmaster games where this type of position comes up. And I'll go from that e3 move order. Like I said, it could also, these type of positions could also come out of bishop to f4 by white. But we'll stick with moves where white plays e3 for this video. All right, so the first one, we have a player that's around 2,700, Vladimir Malakov. And he kind of shows us why this is a good isolated pawn position for black. And so now we get into this position where white has played e3. And so the 2,700 player here does exactly what we're saying. He blasts the center with c5. And he did that because he's got firm control over d5, and white hasn't, played aggressively. So he's happy to take on this isolated queen's pawn. Now he develops normally now. Like I said, when you play strong players, they'll probably delay the capture on c5 until we have moved our dark squared bishop. And that way they save a tempo, because we have to move our bishop twice in a row to recapture that pawn. And so now we get to this isolated pawn position that we just got done looking at. And we'll kind of, play can go different ways. But the key thing to remember with this position is that it's going to be very hard for white to prevent us from playing d4 at a moment that we feel like it, in a moment that's good for us, because we got all this control on d4, the square in front of our isolated pawn. And with this b4 weakness and with this hiding hole on a7 for our bishop, it's very hard for them to keep us from doing that. So he's trying to pressurize our pawn. We say, fine, we have enough protection on it. Just chase him back. And now we see our Chebanenko hiding hole from this a6 move. And now this grandmaster sets up a mating threat. And so white is forced to weaken his pawn structure in some way. He can choose if he wants to play g3 or if he wants to play f4, I guess. He plays f4. And now we'll see that he uses this newly created weakness to cause all kinds of problems for white. And that's one thing we've kind of noticed in these Understanding the Slav videos, is a lot of time we'll use something favorable in our position will end up becoming something else, as like whatever our favorable key aspect of our position is annoys the other player, or they have to try to stop it, and then we end up getting another weakness that we can go after. In this case, now this pawn is much weaker than our pawn on d5, so the e3 pawn is going to be targeted here. Piling up, x-raying through. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the moves because we want to get through the other games too here. But you can just kind of see how easy this isolated queen's pawn position was to play because of that b4 weakness and our control over d4. And white ended up just resigning here. So this is the positions where we get the isolated queen pawn. And so let's look at a game with a couple of heavyweights going at it. And this one will be Bakro, who he's kind of one of our heroes. We've watched him before against Ivan Sokolov, another heavyweight. So what we will notice here you can see here white didn't capture straight away. Developed pieces first, in which case we just develop normally. And now white made the exchanges, which gave us an isolated pawn. So, but this being here and our knight being here doesn't change the fact that we still have a very favorable version of the isolated pawn. And so now what's interesting is Sokolov, being a KG veteran, he's seen all these isolated pawn positions, and he realizes, I'm sure, that this is not a good scenario for him to just let this isolated pawn stick around with this weak b4 square because of a4, and just the fact that black has such good control over d4, which the square in front of the isolated pawn, square in front of our d5 pawn. So he resorts to playing e4. He just wants to bust this thing up. He's like, well, I'll forget about trying to get an advantage. Let's just let everything get kind of liquidated in the center and have an even position. Black's equalized, but it is what it is. And here, interesting play is Bakro realizes how strong his control is over this d4 square, and he says, well, I'm just going to push the pawn to that square. White ends up moving back. And now, interestingly, in this position here, if you put this through a computer, it will show that after d4, e5 is actually strong for white. But Curl realized how strong this d4 square is. So, I wouldn't recommend playing this in the game. Check it with an engine and whatnot. It fails, against an engine. But he's not playing an engine. He's playing a human who didn't like the original isolani position, so he was trying to transform the pawn structure. basically liquidating everything. And this ends up becoming just a bloodbath, actually. Look at all the protection on that d4 pawn. Pieces just flooding in here. And if you just kind of look at the black's pieces compared to white's pieces, they're just kind of like stumbling over each other, and black has all this space. And look at how black just patiently reroutes pieces and just keeps restricting white's play. And then look at that. Wow. So this pawn is just a monster now. And it's supported with this light squared bishop. So this is obviously a losing position. We'll just quickly flip through it. But it just kind of shows the power of that control over d4, because Sokolov didn't react correctly playing e5. This just became a nightmare. Look at this. And like I said, I'm just flipping through quickly because, I mean, the game is over at this point. But I'm not sure why white kept playing, but maybe it's something personal. I'm not sure. But then white threw in the towel there. So that's interesting. I wanted to show that game because I thought that was really interesting how Bacro understood why that was a good isolani, isolated queen's pawn, and so did Sokolov. So Sokolov tried to liquidate that isolated pawn by playing e4. Black just bypassed, which doesn't work according to the computer, but conceptually it's it shows that Bacro understood this position well himself. So let's just look at one last game real quick. We won't spend much time on it, but this one is another heavyweight, Movsesyan, Sergei Movsesyan. I don't know how you pronounce his last name, but he's a 27-47 player versus Sokolov. And we get the same position. So here we go. Now we got this isolated queen's pawn. And once again, Sokolov realizes he doesn't want that thing to keep stay around, so he tries to dissolve it right away. And this time, Movsesyan probably knew you can't actually get away with d4, as appealing as it is and as strong as it is, if white doesn't react correctly. So he decided to liquidate that pawn. And so now, of course, black is just equalized against a 26-69 player. And we'll go through it real quick, but you can see this is not, obviously not bad for black, And they agreed to a draw here. But anyway, I thought this was interesting. It's playing the isolani isn't to everybody's taste, but I do think that these are very easy ones to play, because getting d4 in liquidating that isolated queen's pawn should be pretty easy when we have so much control over d4. So, because this isn't a lecture on isolani or anything, but normally you have more space when you have the isolani. So either you want to attack or you want to push it with some kind of effect, like hopefully it creates a tactic. When you push it, it opens up some pieces, and the other side can either stumble or just flat out, have a tactic that's on the board that they can't do anything to prevent. So anyway, next time we'll look at the final alternative setup in these Chebanenko Slavs, and then we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes of it, looking at the strategy within the main setup itself. So anyway, I hope you found those games interesting, and I hope it helps you understand the alternative setups in the Chebanenko or Chameleon a little bit better. Take care.